Theatre is a legacy of humanity that has allowed human beings to understand themselves through the observation of their own personal stories, emotions, fears, and deepest desires. Both theatre as well as dance has an ancient lineage that can be traced back to the beginnings of every tribal community and civilization. The path of the physical actor consists in practices and trainings which open doors to self-knowledge, creativity, bodily and vocal abilities, and to the exploration of his own imagination in service of creating new interpretations of reality and also options of new realities. We can understand the path of the physical actor as the art of experientially knowing the human phenomenon.
I am a choreographer, a dancer. I could also define myself as a mover. I've been working also as a theater director, and I've been teaching movement to actors and dancers and people from different sources of life. The Enactive Presence Lab has been introducing and researching different practices that are giving to both actors and non-actors, researchers, bring the possibility to really embody those principles, those understandings, and using our body-mind set into a whole different perspective. In that way, we are enriching also the whole field of acting, and we are putting actors as researchers, not necessarily in order to create performances, but more to become themselves researchers, interdisciplinary researchers that can collaborate also in different works of investigation with other fields of knowledge.
This video is not about the art of physical theatre itself, but about embodied cognition and the importance of developing practical methodologies for the education of actors and dancers as future researchers. What is embodied cognition? Cognition is a faculty possessed by all living organisms through their physical structure with which we know reality, its environment, and the different types of interaction that we generate. Therefore, embodied cognition is something that is always happening in us as living beings that possesses a body. It is important to understand that cognition is not just something that happens to living beings like humans, as if cognition were the apex of knowledge of the human being, but is something that we share with all living beings. Cognition, according to Maturana and Varela, is the activity that involves the self-generation and self-perpetuation of living systems. In other words, cognition is the very process of life. So when we begin to move our body in multiple ways, it enhances the ability to know ourselves in the dynamic interaction with our environment as cognitive entities incarnated in a body. That process opens up the possibility to much greater and more diverse experiential range, being also rich in possibilities to dynamic interactions and creativity. That is why embodied cognition is something that involves us deeply, because we are made of cognition and we are designed to know. We are made to know.
Yeah, well, I have the luck to be in the University of Chile in the laboratory, which is a kind of the Santiago School of Cognition, is the name that some people call it, in which Humberto Maturana and Francisco Varela founded a way of thinking about living thing about living organization, the autopoiesis concept. And from this starting point, there is many ways to look for searching how to understand the life in all the aspects, the animal life and the human life. And I started to think that cognition is like a filter. It's how the perception that we as living beings are put some kind of parameters to understand what is happening in the way that we find a stimulus from the environment and how this stimulus start to have sense in our lives. Yeah, it's a filter that in some way serve to us to minimize the chaos of the world. So it's a filter which consists in the different patterns that our brain use to minimize the unpredictability. Because we have a flux of energy that come from our senses, vibrations, electromagnetic vibration in many ways. But this electromagnetic we interpret in some way, which is the different way that a cat interprets the same electromagnetic waves or a dog. But there are some patterns that are common to different species. And this makes us the difference in which a cat sees the world, a bat sees the world, or human see the world. We need to find the answer in our own experience. And that is because it is important to connect with our body, because we feel the experience with our body. It's the mind in our body that defines the way that we see the world.
Let us take a look at the title of this practice-based research called Enactive Presence Lab. In order to get closer to the meaning of the word inactive, let us shortly meet the Chilean neurobiologist Francisco Varela, one of the main thinkers of modern cognitive science. This is a great interview from 1983, where Varela was already very clear and intuitive about his epistemic turns.
For an animal, for a living being, to have a world, it's something that he actually shapes and creates over evolution and in its own history. It is not something that is given. So these two questions are fundamental and unique to living beings. In that sense, biology holds the key to the understanding of cognition. I'm completely convinced of that. And I think that the field is slowly recognizing that. An example, you have just to look at the new trends even in the engineering-oriented artificial intelligence to realize that many people are beginning to turn around to say, interesting, what we thought it was the hardest is in fact the simplest, and vice versa. What we thought it was the simplest is the hardest. What is the simplest, for example, is the fact that you can have a little tiny insect that flies around the room without bumping onto a wall. Tiny little thing. There's no human device that can do that. And people in artificial intelligence are beginning to say, these very simple living things can do something that it is so profound that that's where we have to look to understand what is truly intelligence. Yeah. Right? While in the early 60s, the idea was that true intelligence was proving theorems and doing deductions. So all the effort went into building a machine that was like a gigantic reasoner, again with the notion, rationalistic tradition, that mind is logic, is deduction, is inference, is mostly about logical rules. In fact, to me, and I think, again, this is beginning to be appreciated even by the engineers, mind and cognition is fundamentally about being embodied into actions in the world. Very simple sensory motor tasks are absolutely key.
Enactive Presence Lab research. Within this research, the word presence is understood as one of the main foundations of the art of physical theatre. Presence is composed of the word present and essence. In other words, the art of being present while preserving the essence. Enactive comes from the word enaction, proposed by Francisco Varela for cognitive sciences, that could be defined as co-emerging representation. Our knowledge is neither simple perception of an objective reality out there, nor a processing of information captured by our sensory windows, but rather process that is built from our sensory motor body experience. Embodied cognition allows an important epistemological turn regarding the essential question: how do we know? The proposal for the research of the Enactive Presence Lab is to establish bases and concrete practices to situate actors and dancers as researchers through updated and innovative ways of generating reflective theory based on experience. The Enactive Presence Lab dialogues with other sources of knowledge, such as applied neurosciences, transpersonal psychology, sports sciences, and contemplative studies, among others, to put the actor-dancer as a future researcher and generator of knowledge based on first-person experience and on the understanding of interaction with other sources of knowledge. The main three pillars of the Enactive Presence Lab are movement practices alone, with partners, and in groups, always with the focus of activating the intrinsic intelligence of the performer's body, a more primal body. Then, breathing practices and meditation from yogic pranayama, Tibetan Tsa-lung breathing principles, to more modern breathing and visualization techniques for elite sports. And finally, the primordial phase, a unique practice that reconfigurates the face of the performer or researcher in order to experience an amplified perceptual mode of exploration. For that, Elias Cohen explored diverse psychophysical practices designed by himself throughout his career of 20 years as a physical theater director, movement teacher, and researcher, with different groups of theater and dance students as well as professionals. The co-researcher is Hernán Diaz, a neurobiologist that collaborates in the same laboratory in Chile where Francisco Varela developed part of his work. The research was supported by data that emerged from the performing practices through EEG technology that can measure brain activity such as brain waves to transpose the results of the subjective experiences of the performers into quantitative measurements. A brief summary. There are 5 main brain waves. Gamma appears in heightened perception, learning, problem-solving tasks. Beta associated with alert and active thinking. Alpha, when we are physically and mentally relaxed, and soft meditations and being creative. Theta, associated with creativity, insight, dreams, and deep meditation. And delta, the slowest of all brainwaves, strongest when we are enjoying restorative sleep in a dreamless state. This kind of data is relevant and necessary within a project involving artistic and scenic practices as research, as the scientific and quantifiable aspects allow us to increase the dimension of information and interpretations of the experience that usually have a high amount of intersubjectivity. The EEG system was operated via emotive epoch technology, which is a wireless helmet that permits to see the brain functioning while performing any activity in real time by sending signals to a program decoding them into EEG. By using this device, specifically made for neuroscientific research, it is possible to trace and see which areas of the brain get more activated than others while performing different tasks. It can register the intensity of emotional emergence, extent of muscular tension, extent of interest while doing an action, and the interconnection between brain hemispheres.
Percibir tipos de contenidos que puedan estar en tu mente.
The participants were trained to pay permanent attention to their objective and subjective experiences during the practices. Objective attention corresponds to physiological perceptions such as state of respiration, heart rate sensation, and body temperature. Subjective attention corresponds to the perception of feelings, distractions, arising thoughts, and mental associations during practice. Main results and conclusions. The introduction of contemplative practices such as meditation in its different kinds is essential in order to train the capacity of accurate self-attention that enables performers the introspective awareness of mental processes and behaviors while engaging in both passive and active embodied practices. Normal performers without any contemplative practice showed to be less accurate in the moment of verbalizing their experiences about their objective and subjective attention after any given practice. Another result of this research showed that different embodied practices generate changes in the perceptual states of the performer, modifying the brain waves. During the practices of the Enactive Presence Lab, 80% of the participants managed to produce alpha waves in a sustained manner. Alpha waves appear in an optimal state of relaxation, allowing focused attention and associative capacity, enhancing creativity. Maintaining that brainwave despite the different intensities of physical work and even in physical interaction with others can be a great contribution of Enactive Presence Lab. Control groups without any bodywork experience showed to be mainly in beta waves during practice with few periods of alpha waves. A main idea behind the Enactive Presence Lab is that physical actors and dancers become researchers in active collaboration within investigations of other sources of knowledge such as psychology, biology, physics, mathematics, or social sciences, to just name a few. The embodied practices from Enactive Presence Lab were concretely tested in collaboration with several different research projects, one of them coming from astronomy. Let us meet with Sebastian Perez and Anya Yermakova speaking about their experiences with embodied learning practices within their own researches and the future of embodied learning in the academical context.
So my name is Sebastian Perez. I'm an astrophysicist, currently professor in astrophysics, working on the problem of how planets are formed. That's my line of research. So Recreo Espacial is embodied learning experiences to learn the fundamental laws and the basics of astrophysics. So learn the building blocks of our theories. What's our position in the galaxy, how things move, what's conserved in the dynamics of the universe, what are these quantities energy, angular momentum, mass. What are these things that are conserved in the universe? And then what are the forces that are involved in the interactions, like mainly gravity? So after you acquire this an intuition for those fundamental laws, for those building blocks of our theories, you can apply it to a more difficult astronomical astrophysical problem. That's what we did with this group of professional dancers and movers and movement artists. We acquire an intuition for the angular momentum conservation, for the energy conservation, for what gravity is, and then we proposed one of the astrophysical problems that we have today that we haven't been able to solve: how are planets formed? So we asked this group of dancers to improvise, because that's what scientists are doing at the same time. We are trying to improvise, add terms to the equations, remove some other terms, play with simulations, and see what happens. Do more observations, gather more data, play with it, until we find an ingredient that allows us to understand how planets form. So the movers started moving across this studio, and that was the instruction, that was the narrative. We want to form a planet. You are all particles, planetesimals, in this protoplanetary disk. You have to orbit the star. You have to move continuously with a lot of energy, and you have to manage to create this more well-defined structure during the lifetime of the protoplanetary disk. And a lot of interesting structures started emerging. The movers were just using their intuition as bodies, as planetesimals, as building blocks for a planet. At some point, I noticed that one of the movers started walking on 4 legs, like it kind of slowed down a little bit and started walking with 4 legs, and the others started climbing on top. So that mover was kind of sacrificing himself for others to piggyback or ride along with him. And that's exactly one of the ideas that we have. People doing embodied learning, people using these tools to teach and allow for their students to acquire an intuition rather than a very specific symbolic knowledge. It's something that is happening. Every day there are more people doing this. It's hard because you want to keep the depth and the rigor of the knowledge, but it's perfectly doable. It's actually quite powerful.
My name is Anya Yermakova. I'm currently finishing up my doctorate at Harvard in history of logic and math, and weaving it together with contemporary narratives in embodiment. And apart from that, I'm also a composer and a dancer, also just finishing some art science projects. So I think the best way I've come to understand what embodied learning is, what embodied learning could be, it's a way of improvising, first and foremost, understood as, what is improvisation? Understood as putting kind of well-defined constraints on something, constraints that necessarily have your body in it, so not constraints that are abstract, but constraints that also take into account where your body is situated within those constraints. And then exercising freedom. Exercising a way of being free. And then those constraints, they can shift, they can move, they can be dynamic, but for some point of time they have to be well defined. Then the act of freedom necessarily involves your body. One can't be free without their body, right?
A very important aspect and result of this practice-based research was the introduction of the primordial phase practice inside the Enactive Presence Lab. it showed to be one of the most relevant factors in the experience of many of the performers. What is the practice of the primordial phase?
The primordial phase is the possibility of letting all the muscles of your face drop. When you drop all the muscle of your face, or the configuration of, let us say, your social face, we give less stimulus to the brain, and we let the neocortex somehow get a little bit, we could say, block. So this kind of sequential, rational development of our mind in order to understand in a logical way stops, and we create the capacity or establish the possibility of connecting with a more holistic, perceptual capacity of interacting with the reality. You just relax the face, you drop a little bit the eyes, you let the eyes be unfocused. And even you can turn your eyes to the inside, letting your white eyes. Blah. In the moment you do that, your brain is no longer spending energy in trying to create a configuration of what is going on from the outside. Usually what the brain will do is trying, in a normal way of perceiving, your brain will try to complete the information of all the stimulus of your senses, of what you are seeing, what you are hearing. The whole face has a configuration in order to do that. But when you drop that configuration, the brain enters in a completely different mode. This mode is important because it brings you the possibility of perceiving or being yourself in a different perceptual mode. And within other perceptual mode, you can also register a different experiences where you can create a complementary story about a certain experience. It has been really enriching for people to practice different ways of movement or researching or ideas through the primordial phase possibility. That's why we encourage him.
Through the practice, a large percentage of the performers managed to quickly activate theta waves. Theta brain waves occur most often when sleeping, but are also dominant in deep meditation. Theta is a gateway to learning, memory, and intuition. In theta, our senses are withdrawn from the external world and focused on signals originated from within. In theta, we are in a dream. Vivid imagery, intuition, and information beyond our normal conscious awareness. We consider that the practice of the primordial phase can be a powerful tool at the moment of letting emerge intuitive knowledge within research processes. To train embodied researchers who can sustain and produce both alpha and theta waves while exploring different inputs can be of great interest for any given practice-based research. Undoubtedly, more exploration and quantifiable research should be conducted regarding this practice. So far, cognitive sciences and the promising emerging field of studies called contemplative sciences have carried out fantastic and in-depth studies based mainly on contemplative practices in first person. In recent years, a large number of theoretical investigations on the phenomenon of embodied cognition and the perspective of inaction proposed by Varela have had a great development in the academic environment. Unfortunately, during this research, few practical and embodied approaches were found in the academia on the phenomenon of enaction that have scientific measurements on the human interaction with other humans and other environments within a dynamic process, and not only through static measurements of contemplative practices. This research proposes, through the Enactive Presence Lab, the physical actor not only as a performance maker, but also as a promising, practical, embodied researcher with solid tools of exploration on the integrative possibilities within the field of embodied cognition in collaboration with other disciplines of knowledge.
Se fue la mitad. ¿Ah? ¿Suena mal? Está suelta la cuerda. Sí.
¿Conocen este saludo?